morning to everyone. I'm Joanna Helms, the Economic Development Director for the town of Apex. I'm also the current president of the Board of Directors for NCEDA, and I am your MC today. Would like to welcome you all to NCEDA's first webinar of 2024. Happy to have you with us. Before starting the program, I would like to acknowledge our NCEDA annual sponsors, whose logos you will now see on your screen. These companies and organizations support every component of NCEDA's expansive mission and our growing body of programs that we provide. So our special thanks to all these sponsors for their generous support, which, by the way, includes the ability for us to provide webinars like this one. Okay, so let's get started. Well, we all have questions about the economy in 2024 and beyond, of course. So today's webinar topic, the economy of 2024 and the future of work, will include a look into what to expect in 2024, with special attention paid to GDP, growth, employment, and inflation. A deep dive into the future of work will also provide insights into what we can anticipate in the years to come. Today's presenter is Laura Ullrich. Laura is the Senior Regional Economist with at the Charlotte branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Prior to joining FRB, Laura was the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs and a Professor of Economics at Winthrop University. Her research interests include higher education, school finance reform, local and state level tax and expenditure analyses, and the economic impact of local development. Laura holds a doctorate and a master's degree in economics from the University of Tennessee, and she has a bachelor's degree in economics also from the University of Georgia. So if we have time, I'd really like to hear from Laura on how exactly that conflict works in her house, as we know that those two teams have absolutely no love lost for one another. So that could be a whole nother webinar. But anyway, we are lucky to have her with us today. You know, she was with us at the annual conference last year in Wilmington, and it was, she just knocked the ball right out of the park. So we're thrilled to have her back here today to share her insights. So Laura, again, welcome, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, and I'll settle your question real quick. So I was born and raised in Athens, Georgia, and so was my husband, and my father-in-law played at Georgia. I think I was a sixth-generation Georgia grad. So I went to the University of Tennessee, but I have definitely never worn Tennessee orange. So no worries about that. Definitely a Georgia Bulldog. So happy to be with you guys today virtually. I would wish I could see you all in person, but this is a good substitute as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get after it. I'm going to share a lot of information with you today about what I see going on in the economy, with a special attention to this idea of future work. And I know I talked a little bit about that last year. I'm going to touch on again some of the statistics I presented last year and also update some of those with new data, and also look into some other things that we're seeing and talk a bit about what we're doing at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond on the topic. So I do have the Q&A open as I present. If you put in a question that's relevant to the slide I'm on, I'll try to address it immediately. If not, I'll make sure to try to save some time at the end for questions. As always, I get to remind people that the views I'm going to express are mine alone and don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So where are we right now in terms of the economy? You know, this has definitely not been a boring time to be an economist. Certainly has not been a boring time to be an economist at the Federal Reserve. Since COVID, we have really been mostly in a period of pretty strong economic growth. You know, 2021 was very strong economic growth. 2022, we had beginning of the year, 2 quarters of slightly negative GDP, but then the end of the year rebounded a bit. And then 2023 was far above economists' expectations. So if you had heard me talk exactly a year ago, I would have told you that expected growth for 2023 was flat. People were expecting zero growth. So some models were expecting recession, some were not, but overall the expectations were that it would be around zero. That is not what happened at all. So instead, what we saw was pretty strong, kind of typical economic growth at the beginning of the year, but then the last part of the year came in very strong, and I'll show you all this data. That being said, some sectors are hit harder than others, right? So last week I did a presentation to about 250 women that work in commercial real estate. Their business has been hit extraordinarily hard because they're so interest rate sensitive and because of the changing kind of work dynamics that we'll talk about. So although in general, the economy has not been in a recession since 2020, and we don't see one in the near future, there are segments of the economy that are really struggling, and that's important to acknowledge. The fears of recession do seem to have lessened. If you look at estimates for growth in 2024, they're still pretty moderated. People aren't expecting a ton of growth, but less models are predicting a recession in 2024 than we're predicting it in 2023. And really, this is because of, I think, two factors. Number one, the fact that inflation is coming down, which we'll talk about. And then number two, consumer spending has just remained incredibly robust, much more robust, I think, than most economists would have expected. The pace of job growth continues to be impressive, especially in states like North Carolina. But once again, I want to acknowledge that while this is true in many urban spaces, there are plenty of rural places in North Carolina. And some of you are on this call thinking, yeah, we're not seeing a lot of employment growth where I live. Well, you're right. If you're in a more rural place, you probably are not. There are counties across North Carolina that are continuing to lose population and employment. And a lot of this is industry and geography based, but it's also because of the pandemic. What we've seen is that people have migrated. Nationally, there's been a lot of migration to mid-sized metros. So places like a Charlotte or a Raleigh, Charleston, South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina. So we're seeing this. I cover the Carolinas, both North and South Carolina, and we're seeing it in both states. Inflation still is above our 2% average target, so the work is not yet done. However, the most recent reports, especially the ones to close out 2023, came in very positive. The FOMC, though, has been really clear that they're going to continue to do the work they need to do to get inflation down. So we'll talk more about that as we go through today. All right, so let's start with GDP. So this is real GDP growth annualized. And you'll see that pattern. I mentioned, 2020 was a wild ride. As a matter of fact, we have to kind of cut off this graph and make this weird chart because if we included those bars for 2020, they go off the charts. We had the largest one quarter expansion, the largest one quarter decrease in history. But then since then, we've had pretty strong economic growth. If you look back to the left there, you'll see that this last third quarter growth number for GDP in 2023 was extraordinarily high. The second estimate has come in at 5.2%. Prior to COVID, we had not seen growth like that since 2014 in a single quarter. So this is very strong economic growth, which, I think we have to pause and consider how phenomenal this is, because this is real GDP. So this controls for inflation. So real GDP is the value of all final goods and services that are produced in the United States in a given year. And so what this tells you is real consumption was remaining strong, which I'm going to show you the numbers on that in just a second, even in the midst of extraordinarily high cumulative inflation, right? I mean, we've had inflation month over month over month for a couple of years now. And so that's really a pretty interesting phenomenon. And also with higher interest rates. So unexpected, like I mentioned. On the far right there, you'll see FOMC projections. So the FOMC is the group at the Fed that votes on interest rates. So when you hear the Fed has raised interest rates or held interest rates steady, that's the FOMC. It's made up of the 7 governors who reside in DC, led by Jerome Powell, and then the 12 Federal Reserve Bank presidents. Every other meeting, those 19 people make projections on what they think is going to happen in the economy. And so these are those 19 people's projections. The gray bar is the range of projections. The red diamond is median projection. You'll see these on a couple of other slides too. And you can see that going forward, FOMC members are not expecting a recession. Now, that being said, recessions don't generally happen because of something that happens slowly over time. It's because of some shock to the economy. So if we think about the last 3 recessions, we had the COVID recession, which was just a very short one-quarter recession in 2020. We had the financial crisis, which the actual recession was really triggered by really when Lehman Brothers fell and the housing crisis that happened around that. And then prior to that, we had a recession that happened shortly after 9/11. And in that year, we also had Enron fail and some other big company failures. So expansions, the positive side of the business cycle typically goes negative, goes into a recession by something that's unexpected. So just because the FOMC members aren't expecting a recession doesn't mean we won't have a recession. It's just given the data they have at this last meeting in December, they're not expecting one next year or in the years going forward. Most models do not have a recession built in for 2024. And the main reason for that, as I've already alluded to, is this chart right here. This is consumption. So the top line is total personal consumption expenditures. Middle line is, and then it's broken out between services and goods. Middle line is good, services. Bottom line is goods. This controls for inflation. So this is the real value of goods and services. So you can kind of think of this as how much people are putting in their basket, right? So kind of visualize a grocery cart, like how much are people putting in that cart? And that amount has gone up. People have been putting more in their cart, even though prices have been going up. This kind of defies, or not kind of defies, it defies economic theory. But what the reason for that, the reason it's defying kind of basic economic theory is that there has been a ton of stimulus that's come into the economy. And when I say stimulus, I don't want you to just think of like stimulus checks. I want you to also think about PPP loans or the ESSER funds that K through 12 school districts got, the HERF funds that higher education got. Hospitals got money. We had the Inflation Reduction Act. We had the infrastructure bill. We had the CHIPS Act. There are all this legislation that happened that caused an influx of money into the system, and that has propped up consumption. The other thing that has propped up consumption is the strong decline we saw in consumption during 2020. So consumption really pulls back. People have excess savings at that point, and then they use those excess savings to continue spending. Consumption makes up about 70% of GDP. So as long as consumption stays really strong, it is unlikely to see that we would see a recession or a serious recession. So this is really what has prevented us from being on a recessionary period. Somebody just asked here, would a robust labor market also buoy consumer spending? Sure. So the labor market being, us having, and I'm going to talk a lot about the labor market today, but the labor market, us continuing to add jobs certainly props up consumer spending as well. And, I would say now we're also seeing that wages are continuing to go up now above inflationary levels. And so because of that, there are some real wage increases. And real wages for the average American, the typical American, had not increased since 1975 until 2020. And so Americans had not seen, overall in general, had not seen a lot of real wage increases. So now we're seeing some of that as well. So, I do see a question here that I want to address, and I think this is really important, especially as we talk through what we're going to talk through today. This is aggregate data, right? This is the broad macro picture. So like I mentioned before, just because the broad macro picture looks good doesn't mean there aren't individual sectors or individual categories of people who are really hurting in this economy. And one of the things we can see is that high income individuals, high income families are dominating this spending story in a way that is really significant. We do not have great data on that, or else I would be showing it to you here. But we do have some data, bank account data, and some other data that lends us to know that this is the case. We also we do a ton of outreach with businesses, and this is where it becomes important because we talk to, for example, landlords that serve high income people, but also or others that serve lower income families. We talk to nonprofits that do work for low income families. We talk to grocery stores about buying patterns. And I feel very confident in saying that the bottom 50% of the income distribution is having a hard time. Inflation works as an awful tax against earnings if you live paycheck to paycheck. If you live paycheck to paycheck and prices go up 9%, you have to buy 9% less, right? Like, unless you're going to take out additional debt, which in the current climate, debt is harder to access. So we haven't seen debt rates. If you adjust debt for income, And for inflation, we are not seeing debt rates that exceed what we saw before the pandemic. And actually, household debt service, so the amount of money households are spending on interest payments, has just now really reached where it was in 2019, because so many families are locked into low interest mortgages, car loans, things like that. So, and also paid down a lot of debt during that pullback in spending that you can see there in 2020. So it is, I would say, and this is my view as an economist, you might find economists that have different views, but my view is that it's very concerning that the bottom half of the income distribution is struggling in the midst of the very top doing as well as they are doing, because in the long run, that creates a lot of additional issues, right? So I know I'm president of the board of a homeless shelter. We're seeing record demand for our services. We talk to folks that run food pantries and things like that. They're seeing record demand. And then there are, in some communities, increases in crime and homelessness and things like that. There's spillover effects to this situation. So I appreciate that question being asked here in the Q&A. And I think, from a policy perspective, there are things that we have to think about as we go forward there. One of the things that is a really good sign is that global supply chain issues have really calmed. So inflation can really happen for two reasons. Number one, it can be that demand for goods and services go up, right? And that's what we just talked about with consumption. Demand for goods and services has been very high. It can also, though, happen because of a supply shock, so a sharp decline in supply. And during COVID, we saw both of these things. So we saw demand go up, especially for certain goods and services. Like, not the demand for everything didn't go up the past 4 years, right? But certain things have really gone up. And the supply chain issues caused a significant supply shock. The first time I ever heard of COVID, which at the time was called the coronavirus, was I was talking to a contact about what they were seeing in the economy, and they had they got some input products from a factory in Wuhan, and it had shut down, right? Like, there's this virus called coronavirus, don't really know what it is, but it shut down this plant, and now I can't get the inputs to produce my goods. That then magnified 1,000-fold, right? It was very difficult to get products in and out of countries. There were factories shut down all over the world, and so that created what you see here. While there still are supply chain issues, those have really, really calmed down. And so there are still isolated shortages. It's still hard to get certain goods or services. Sometimes it's because of where they're produced. So, if we talk to farmers, it's still hard for them to get some fertilizer products because so many of them are made in the Ukraine, Russian region. There are other products, like things that are used to make solar panels. Some of those have been difficult to get to because they're from the Uyghur region in China that's dealt with some slavery issues. So there's things like that. But in general, now we are back to pre-COVID levels in terms of supply chain pressure. I really believe that the fact that inflation has come down as much as it has, while demand has still remained so strong, shows that actually much of inflation was driven by the supply side. I think that's why we're seeing this is a very good thing that this calmed down, because the Fed's actions are going to affect demand much more than supply. So this is good news. Housing starts and permits. This is really interesting. So the dotted line is the 1990 average of housing starts, so new home builds. This number never recovered really from the Great Recession. That number had gone up tremendously leading up to the Great Recession. That was part of the cause of it, right? Cheap money, people are building houses they can't really afford, all this bubble bursts, people get foreclosed on, builders go out of business, and this never recovered. So until COVID, we never got back to even the average from the 1990s. And this has been very concerning, especially in the larger metro areas in the Carolinas, because we need a lot of new homes built for all the people moving in. We saw that go up a lot in 2021, 2022, and then it declined significantly as interest rates went up, right? It becomes way more expensive to get a mortgage, to buy a house. Construction costs are up, lot supplies and issues, so many less home builds. We have now seen that bounce back up quite a bit. This is A, very interesting to us, but B, something that we want to watch really closely. And the reason for that is as we travel around, and that's our job as outreach economists, we're out and about all the time. There is nowhere we go that housing doesn't come up as an issue. It comes up everywhere. It comes up in rural areas. It comes up in urban areas. And this map really shows why. This is the whole 5th district for the Federal Reserve, Bank of Richmond. And the green counties you see there are rural counties. The blue counties are urban. And what this shows is the percentage of families within each county that are housing cost burdened, which means they spend 30% or more of their income on housing specifically. And what you'll notice here is, interestingly, in North Carolina, there are only 6 counties, 5 rural counties, 1 urban county, which I think is Alexander, where less than 20% of households are housing cost burden. And in South Carolina, there's only 1 county. It's really amazing. There are many more in Virginia, which I think is interesting. Certainly a lot in West Virginia, which makes sense, right? Because West Virginia, the demand for housing is much, much lower. But you can see, in some of the metro areas in Asheville and Charlotte, outside of Raleigh, where Greensboro, where over, 28% of households are cost burdened, Wilmington as well. So in these communities, this gets back to the question about some people not being able to afford basic needs while others are doing very well. And I see there was a question that came in about credit card debt. Credit card debt is up in nominal terms. It's at record levels, but if you adjust it for income and inflation, it's just back to where it was in 2019. So actually, we are not seeing a lot of that consumption coming from credit card debt. We are seeing a slightly increasing share coming from credit card debt, so we'll be looking at that. But it really more is dominated by the spending of high-income households that still have excess savings. That, I think when people think about stimulus, they think about these stimulus checks, but I actually think the PPP loans were much more stimulative probably in the end, because they were massive amounts of money. That money trickled into personal income because of how businesses are set up. So, this is, there's going to be a lot of research done on how everything was done and if it was the right way or the wrong way. It could take a couple years for that to come out, but it's something we're really going to follow. But as we talk about things like housing or gas or, other food, as households spend more of their money on housing, they have less money to spend on everything else, right? They have less disposable income. And so even if high income households are spending a lot more on housing, that's going to dampen their spending on everything else. So housing is for sure a tremendous issue in the Carolinas. And I think it's interesting to look at this and see, hey, yeah, it is an issue, and it's almost as big of an issue in North and South Carolina now as it is in Maryland, which is a much more expensive state to live in. So just very, very interesting. Incomes are much higher in Maryland, right, than they are in North and South Carolina. So interesting thing for us to pay attention to. This is also super interesting. So I would never have shown this graph in a presentation even a year ago. This is now a super interesting story. This is construction in the manufacturing sector. That's the dark blue line. And then the lighter blue line is specifically construction in the computer, electronic, and electrical sector of manufacturing. This includes anything related to EVs, so electric vehicles, batteries, recycling of batteries, anything related to that. It also includes data centers. There is a tremendous amount of construction going on in North Carolina in these sectors. And you can really see this here. This right now is construction. This will translate into jobs in these sectors. So I know some of you are located in counties where there are massive, right? Like if you're located in Chatham County, massive numbers of jobs that are supposedly coming into the EV space. So this will be a very interesting thing to watch in 2024 and 2025 in both North and South Carolina. So we are seeing inflation come down. Like I mentioned, I think maybe this is more supply driven than demand driven. There was, you may have seen last week, there was a bit of an uptick in what we call headline CPI last month. You can see that in the red dotted line. But core CPI, and economists are more interested in core, I'll come back to why that is in a second, actually declined slightly. So it's moving in the right direction. The past 3 months before last month, it had moved rapidly in the right direction, more rapidly than economists expected, which is great. But we're still well above that 2% average target. I mentioned that economists prefer pay more attention to core. You'll see that core inflation, that blue line, is much more stable. Core inflation takes all inflation and then strips out energy prices, direct energy prices, and food prices. The reason for that is those prices are much more volatile, and those prices generally depend heavier on global commodity markets. So the actions of the Federal Reserve, for example, are not likely to impact the global price of oil, for example. That is set by other factors. And so sometimes when you see these movements in oil prices or food prices, that's not actually about inflation. That's about other things that are going on in those global commodity markets. So it basically, the headline number has more noise in it. And you can see sometimes core is above headline, sometimes it's below because of that noise. Right now it's above. And so that headline number that comes out, we would say that makes it look a little better than we actually think it is, because we think it's closer to 4% still. The Federal Reserve uses as our primary metric of inflation the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, PCE, and the core PCE is between 3 and 5% at this point, so it's lower than CPI. It's a similar measure, it just has a broader basket of goods and services that it considers. And I'll point out here that once again, you have those FOMC projections. For 2024, you can see that there's at least one person at FOMC that thinks we'll still be at 3% inflation, but there's others that think we'll get between 2 and 2.5%. This is really going to drive the actions of the Federal Reserve this year. So do they cut rates? How many times do they cut rates? This release, if you're going to pay attention to one thing every month, this is what I would pay attention to when it comes out, because this is really the target that they're specifically looking for, is how to get to back to 2% inflation. So what's driving inflation at this point? We've already talked about housing, right? But it really is housing cost is the shelter component. So you can see how this has changed over time. And I do like to point people back to the middle of 2021. This is when people were calling inflation transitory, and this inflation really was transitory. That gray bar that you see there is the price of used vehicles. So used vehicle price increases were going up extremely rapidly during that period of time. That's not something that the Federal Reserve should really address. We shouldn't use monetary policy to impact used car prices. But you can see then there was this rapid change starting in late 2021, early 2022, when that green bar got bigger. This is the price of everything else. So really, inflation became what we call broad-based at that point. But you can see in the past few months that green bar has gotten smaller. There's even been a couple months where it's been very small. But the pink bar has become a bigger percentage of the growth in CPI. That pink bar is rent and what we call owner imputed rent. So this imputes the cost of living in a home if you own it. And this continues to be a big driver. We are hearing, so we talked to a lot of the landlords, a lot of folks in multifamily and also residential real estate. And we are hearing on the multifamily side that rents have started in some communities actually decreasing, but even in the hottest communities, they've flattened. And so we do expect that to calm down a bit more in the coming months. But housing costs, the cost of shelter, is certainly something that is really significant right now. So have rates peaked? I think this is the question everybody is asking. If you look at what the FOMC thought they were going to do based on what's called the dot plot, they thought they were going to raise rates one more time and they didn't. So do rates come down from here? I think it's time will tell. I do want to point out though, show you a bit of historical context and show you that typically rates, they come down in stepwise fashion, but the patterns kind of differ depending on what period of time it is. I think some people in their minds think that once rates start falling that they'll go back down to zero very quickly. I do not think that is necessarily the case. I think there's a strong debate to be had on whether or not a zero bound federal funds rate is appropriate unless you're in a severe recession. And so, and until 2008, we had really never had that. So this is, for years we heard we were at historically low rates. That was true. I think it's yet to be seen whether it goes back to that or stays somewhere more around 2 or 2.5%. We shall see. If you look right now on the dot plot, actually I don't have it here, but if you look in the dot plot, which comes out every other meeting as well with those projections, you can see that the median FOMC participant expects 3 cuts in 2024. Markets, though, are expecting 6 right now. So I will say that many of the market models in the past year had the Fed cutting rates in 2023. I never saw where that came from. I just, I spent a lot of time reading Fed stuff and listening to the Fed governors and presidents, and I just didn't see where that was coming from. But we'll see if markets are right or if the FOMC participants are right. But certainly people are expecting cuts in 2024. So let's talk about labor. I want to spend, since this is kind of the primary topic here, want to talk about this. Nationally, we are well above pre-COVID levels of employment. We have many more people at this point working than we had before COVID as a total number, not a percentage. I'm going to come back to that. We also have more jobs than we've ever had in the United States. But we have not reached that pre-COVID trajectory. So that blue dotted line is pre-COVID trajectory, and we have not gotten back there. Interestingly, if I took this back further, you would also see that we never got back to our pre-Great Recession trajectory. So these economic shocks have long-standing impacts where it does knock down kind of the potential of labor market, maybe permanently, but at least for a long period of time. You can see there the monthly changes month over month, how many jobs we're adding. We're still adding a significant number of jobs each month. To put that into context, we need to add about 80 to 100,000 jobs a month to keep up with labor force churn, people passing away, new people entering the labor market. And so anything over 100,000, I think of as expansionary. Anything under 80, I would think of as kind of a contraction. And so in December, it was 216,000 jobs. That's still a really strong jobs report. And we haven't had one under 100,000 in years at this point. So really strong job growth, all things considered. And in places like North Carolina, we are even beyond our pre-COVID trajectory. Oops, something happened on my end on my computer real quick. I'm going to try to figure out, I don't know. Liz, can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, my other monitor just completely shut off. That really, hold on. I'm having some sort of issue. 1 second, just give me a second. I've never had this happen before. We're just going to do a 1 second pause here. I'm so sorry. My problem now is I cannot see my presentation, so just give me 1 minute. I'm going to unplug my other monitor. Okay, I'm going to do it from here. Liz, you can see my presentation and nothing else?
Yes, correct.
Okay. I'm so sorry about that, guys. God, it scared me to death. I thought it completely shut up. Okay, so this is North Carolina. North Carolina is back above pre-COVID trajectory. And you can see there that besides this kind of weird blip that happened in October, that was due to some manufacturing plant closures. But basically, it's so interesting. Like, we lost all these jobs in October because these manufacturing plants closed, and then like the next month we just add them back. Like, people just get other jobs. So it's the labor market has remained really robust. Now, it is super important to point out that this is not the case everywhere. This is the case in North Carolina. So in our other states, in our district, you can see the Carolinas have had much stronger employment recovery than the other states and geographies in our district. And North Carolina has led the way the entire time, which is really interesting, but only North and South Carolina are above the US average. So this is what I really want to talk about today, though, because this impacts all of you in one way or another. So this is participation rates. labor force participation rates, I'm intentionally showing you here data back to post-World War II. And the reason I'm doing that is because I personally believe that post-World War II is the most similar to the labor market that we're in right now. Post-World War II, we had very strong demand for goods and services, but we had a labor shortage, and we had a labor shortage for pretty obvious reasons, right? We had people coming back from the war, the GI Bill had been introduced, people went back to school. A lot of people went back to school. We also had people who came back and retired as veterans. We had people who were injured and passed away, right? And we didn't have a lot of women in the labor force. And so what we saw was a pretty significant labor shortage, and companies had to adjust to this. So this is actually one of the periods of time when labor unions got really strong, because employees had a lot of power in this environment. And so after that, there was a pretty strong response. And you'll see this tremendous growth that happened from 1960 to 1990 in labor force participation rates. And this was driven by two phenomenons. The first is baby boomers, right? So the baby boom generation is born. And then by the 1960s, they start entering the labor market. And then by the 1990s, everyone is in the labor market. And then also you had women entering the labor force in big numbers. So overall labor force participation rates went up 8%. Female labor force participation rates went up 17%. But these rates have been falling since 2000. And the new BLS estimates estimate that this rate will fall to 60.4% by 2032. So it has not recovered to pre-COVID norms. I'll show you what groups are not recovering in just a second, but we haven't recovered. And the data are telling us that it's likely to fall even more significantly. So this is going to be a struggle because we have a smaller percentage of because of demographic shifts, we have a smaller percentage of people that are going to be working age. And so we have to figure out how to adjust for this in labor markets. So I wanted to show you some pretty interesting pictures. The first one is the same data broken down by race and sex. And to make it not too messy, I just included white and Black men and women. I want to show you some interesting patterns here. The first is that, probably unsurprisingly, male labor force participation rates have always been higher than female. White male labor force participation rates in the U.S. have always been the highest of this group. Black male following that, then Black female labor force participation rates have always been higher than white female labor force participation rates. But what I want you to pay attention to is the gap between some of these numbers. So you can see that this has been converging over time. So as female labor force participation rates were going up, male was slowly going down. And if you want to read some interesting stuff, you can read the literature on this, but like why this is. And part of this is because when women went back to work, and I think of my own household, I have 3 teenage boys now, but when I decided to be a working mother, I created many more jobs behind me, or part of many more jobs. And almost all those jobs were filled by women. So, you know, the daycare workers at my kids' daycare, the people that worked at the dry cleaners that I use, the people that clean my house every 2 weeks, all of these are women. And so women actually entering the labor force and professional positions created a lot of other jobs for women in the service sector. At the same time, we have manufacturing changing and going away in many communities, and men did not substitute over to other fields very well, specifically men without college degrees. So since COVID, we have seen this very interesting phenomenon where minority labor force participation has recovered. And you can see here that Black male labor force participation rates are actually quite high. They're as high as they were before the Great Recession. So back to 2007. But during that same time, look at the decline in white male labor force participation since 2007. So what is going on here? There are two things that are going on. One is undoubtedly the demographic shift. So people are aging. We know that the baby boomer generation is the wealthiest one in history. I'm going to come back to that in a minute about something else. We also know that white baby boomers are the ones that hold the wealth. And so part of this is we're seeing people retiring. And Black families may not have that luxury in the same way. But there also are some dynamics that were happening pre-COVID amongst white males in terms of labor force participation rates that are continuing and are troublesome amongst prime age. So prime age is 25 to 54-year-olds. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. On the female side, you'll see that gap between Black female and white female labor force participation rates has widened. Black female labor force participation rates have recovered, but white female have not. And so the overall impact of this is actually really interesting and significant, kind of from an economic history point of view. For the first time since these data have been measured, Black labor force participation rates are now higher than white labor force participation rates in the United States. And you can see there that Black labor force participation rates have recovered by kind of early 2023, but white have not, and even continue to decline a little bit. Much of this driven by older Americans, which you will see here. So the prime age, that 25 to 54, has recovered. It's gone down a little bit the past 2 months, but it has recovered. But this is entirely driven by that prime age is almost entirely driven by minority females. If you break it down by into small, like kind of minutiae, you'll see that. 55 plus, this is where we've seen most of the decline, and almost all that decline is actually, or maybe even at this point, all the decline is in those age 65 plus. They are unlikely to enter the labor force re-enter because of the rules around Social Security. If they turn their Social Security on, they're less likely to come back. You'll see, though, that we've seen kind of persistent declines in college graduate labor force participation rates as well, but even steeper declines amongst those who are high school grads, no college. So one of the things I've seen as I'm talking to companies and communities is companies. So think about the story that I just told you, and the companies that have majority white male employees with no college degree are some of the companies that we're seeing having the hardest time hire and retain workers because of this data that I just told you. So there are industries and companies we talk to that are having no problems with labor right now. I'm going to persist. I'm going to argue that eventually everyone's going to have trouble with labor, but right now some of those groups are not. But those that have a typical employee that fall into some of these groups, or employees that are more likely to be older and things like that, are having a harder time finding people and retaining people. I see a question here. Do I think the push in DEI in the market will push female participation above male in the future? I think this is a super complicated question, but also one I'm almost obsessed with. Those people that know me on this call know that I have these 3 teenage boys, and I actually started doing this research about 15 years ago because I was a professor and I started noticing I had fewer male students in my class and they were performing worse. And I was like, what is going on? Like, what's the deal here? Because I was interested in how, at the time, to make it where my young boys were successful. And so I started doing a lot of research in the space. I'm going to tell you some statistics in a minute of what I think is driving this. I do not think that this is primarily driven by the push to hire more females. I think this is driven by culture more than that. I think that it has become more acceptable, especially for young men, to get started later and not necessarily have full-time jobs. I hope that female labor force participation, if it continues to rise and goes above male, is not because male is falling. That is very concerning to me, especially because there's just some biology that we can't do anything about, where women have to have children, right? And so there are stops in and out of the labor market. And I'm going to show you in a minute that we need people to have babies. We need people to have more babies in the economy for economic growth. And so I am concerned if female labor force participation goes above men because male is falling. And that is because of an interesting statistic, which shows that men out of the labor force, we have time use surveys that look how people use their time. Men out of the labor force spend only 30 minutes more a day taking care of children and other dependents, so elderly parents, than men that work full time, and they spend less time on household duties. So it's not that men are not working and substituting it with domestic care. That's not what's happening. And I'm going to show you some data on what is happening in a second. So what is really going on here is a combination of 2 things. Like I said, one is just a demographic story. We've known this. We know how many people were born in the baby boom. We know there aren't as many of us coming behind them, but it's coming home to roost now. So The median age in 1970 in North Carolina was 26.5. It's now 39.4. And those older age groups are growing. And the reality is people just have not had enough babies to make this better. So you can see the baby boom here. I love this chart because it shows you that baby boom in the 1940s. What is really interesting about this is that we started falling below what we call replacement rate. So every woman needs to have 2.1 babies for us to replace ourselves. It's 2.1 because unfortunately not all children make it to adulthood. But since 1970, we have been falling below that. But you'll see in other periods of times there are kind of these peaks and valleys. If you look at the 70s, for example, it went down and then went up a little bit, and then 1990 it went down, then it goes back up a little bit. But since 2007, we have basically persistently been losing new births. So the fertility rate has been consistently dropping. And so we have this phenomenon, what we call the 2025 cliff in education. Those of you who work in education know about this for sure. But starting in 2025, every year going forward, the number of high school graduates falls. Okay, so that's 18 years after 2007, which you can see was kind of like a little peak there, and then it's fallen since then. So our birth rates are very low now. They're at 1.7 on average for a woman. And so people are not having as many children. I would argue part of that reason is because we are more dependent on female labor at this point. And as myself and anybody else that has been a working parent and has more than one child knows, it's very difficult. So people are choosing not to do that. Plus the cost of childcare is very expensive. The cost of housing, which we talked about, the cost of raising a child is quite high. But there's other phenomenon going on that I mentioned too. And I actually think this is quite related to baby boomer wealth. So the millennial generation is the biggest generation in terms of the number of people, not the percentage. The baby boom is the biggest with percentage, but the millennial is a huge generation too, because they are generally the children of baby boomers. Right now, a lot of times people think millennials are teenagers. They're between 27 and 42. So I'm 45, so I'm like almost a millennial. These are working adults at this point for the most part. But what we have seen is a serious decline in prime age labor force participation. And I'm showing you these numbers prior to COVID, because this is not a COVID story. This was already happening. And so if you look at the difference in labor force participation rates between 1980 and 2019, there was a 5 percentage point decline in prime age male labor force participation. That represents 3 million missing workers. And there's been a lot of research shown to try to look at what people were doing instead of working. And you can see this paper here. There's probably the best paper out there on this by an economist named Aguiar and her co-authors. And interestingly, what they find is that 75% of the increase in hours, leisure hours, so they're not working as much, they have more leisure. What are they doing? 75% of that time is spent playing video and computer games and other computer leisure. This seems outrageous. Like there's probably some of you like thinking this is no way this is true. I always joke that like, I think this seems ridiculous too, but then I look around my own house with my boys and I have to like fight them off of video games constantly and their computers. So this has been a real issue. And there's some interesting research out there about how really this is because of the high quality of video games at this point, and that really the immersive experience, like it truly is like an addictive situation, and people are working less and just gaming and having more computer leisure. I believe that much of this is driven by baby boomer wealth. The reality is some younger adults don't have to work as much because their parents are providing them financial support. And I have a host of stats here for you. The number of adults that are having kind of sometimes you'll hear it called a failure to launch, or a slow to grow up. You can see here like 94% of baby boomers had a first job before age 20, but that dropped to 87% for millennials. That's 5 million worker difference. 2014, for the first time since 1870, young adults were more likely to be living at home than living with a spouse. People are getting married less. 2023, 18.8% of men and 11.4% of women were living at home with their parents. Now, this is up. I put there what the rates were in 2000 there for you. So in 2000, it was 12.4% of men and 7.6% of women. And a census study on these individuals that live at home that are between 25 and 34 shows that 25% of them do not work or attend school. So they're not working, they're not attending school. So if you do the math based on this data, what you'll see is that based on this, between 2000 and 2023, there are now, that's 2.3 million more adults living with their parents in 2023 than we had in 2000. And that's 582,000 more adults who, if that 25% stat holds, are not working or attending school. This is not likely to be happening in low-income households. And the reason for that is that people have to have money to survive, right, in general. And especially young men don't qualify for most government benefits. So these are families of means where young adults are living at home. And, you know, I also point out often that there are also these like kind of constant wealth transfers. So maybe parents aren't giving their kids 20 grand in a check, but they're paying their cell phone bill every month, or they're paying their rent, or they're subsidizing their grandchildren, you know, they're subsidizing school for their grandchildren. And all of this transfer of wealth, we knew this was going to happen. We knew the biggest wealth transfer in history was going to go from baby boomers to millennials. It's now happening, and this is lowering labor force participation. There are 5 million adults in the US that state that they want a job, but they're not working or looking for work. Sometimes we can think this means people are lazy. I don't think that, based on all the data that exists, that that's what these people are dealing with, most of them. They are more likely to be dealing with non-skill barriers. So it might be a single mom who knows she can't afford childcare, or it might be somebody with mental health issues, or somebody that has a criminal background that has looked for a job. So these individuals that are saying, I want to work, but I'm not working, I'm not looking for work, in my opinion, given the stats I just showed you, this is an important population to gauge and to engage. And so how do we get these people in the labor force? How do we get it going? And I see a question here, like, how does the cost of housing influence the numbers I just said with those 25 to 34-year-olds? I think it plays a role, but I also think this is a cultural shift. I think it might be because some 25 to 34-year-olds can't afford the housing they want, and so they live with their parents, and their parents allow it. But I do believe this is driven mostly by choices. I joke about this, but it really is true. My teenage boys hate that this is my area of research, because when they turn 15, you have to get a job. You have to be out there starting this like work journey, and I want you to wear a uniform, and I want you to work for somebody that will fire you if you don't show up. And because I do this research, and all the studies I have done show that really, so for example, I did a study on using some federal data on what predicted if people lived at home when they were 26, and I had a lot of federal government data, and these were people who had gone to college. So these were college bound people, not necessarily college graduates, but they'd gone to college. The two things, well, there were three things that really strongly predicted people moving home. The first was if they were male, they were much more likely to go home than equivalent female. The second was if they had a job when they were age 18. If they were working at age 18, they were much less likely to ever move back home or be living at home at 26. And the third was if they lived away from home the first semester after they finished high school. So that fall semester of college. It was interesting. It didn't really matter if they kind of came and went after that, but it was that first semester that seemed to be really important. And so I do believe that this is a lot about signaling. So is there an expectation that you have to get a job when you're 18? Is there an expectation that it's expected that you leave the house, those sorts of things? So I highly recommend, if this stuff is interesting to you at all, there's a book called Of Boys and Men written by an economist named Richard Reed. It has all sorts of stats about how these things that we're seeing in the workforce, actually we're seeing in elementary schools. This isn't something that like all of a sudden a kid grows up and housing is expensive and they stay at home, or they have student loan debt and they stay at home. We're actually seeing this stuff all the way through schools now. So really interesting, and something I think we have to fix. So, you know, this is funny. One observation, my millennial son says he has friends who live with their parents but have bought themselves Teslas with the money they've saved on rent. Okay, yes, Sarah, you are right. And there actually was a study recently that looked at the rise in luxury goods. So it wasn't about cars, but it was about like Gucci handbags and $2,000 sweaters and things like that. And the number one reason that the demand for luxury goods had gone up was people living at home with their parents and they had excess money to spend. I have a lot of thoughts about that. But anyway, I think you're exactly right about that. And it's some about choice. So just really quickly, I know I'm about to run out of time. I told myself I was going to stop 5 minutes ago. This is a pipeline we put together. You will get these slides after this presentation. You can pay more attention to this. But at the Fed, this is really what I spend my time on, is thinking about these people that are leaking out. Why are 25% of 25 to 34-year-olds that are living with their parents not working? How do we engage them? They've leaked out of this workforce pipeline. We have an education pipeline that should lead to work. And you can choose all different education. You don't have to go get a PhD like I did, right? You can go do a 6-week certificate and have a family sustaining wage. But there are people leaking out, and this is what we really need to address, and something I'm very passionate about. So what might make a difference, the availability of workers? I have a lot of things here. Being flexible. A lot of employers don't want to be flexible, but younger workers are demanding flexibility, and there are ways you can do it, not even just with remote work, but also paying people the day they work or being more flexible with split shifts, things like that. Policy outcomes has to be a part of this. Immigration policy can play a big role, enhanced child tax credits, expanding the Pell Grant, which actually might happen this year. And then I think changing recruiting philosophies. Do you really need someone with a college degree? Could you have someone with a short-term certificate? And encouraging youth to develop into high demand fields. I know there's some great groups in North Carolina that are focusing on that. So where do we go from here? The demographic issues are not going to get better. They're going to get worse. And so labor supply is going to continue to be tight. The reason I talk about issues like I just talked about with these young adults not having kind of this failure to launch is because it's really important. These are hard conversations. I've got a 20-year-old now, almost 20-year-old. He turns 20-year-old in a couple of weeks. So I'm evaluating my own decisions too, right? What do I pay for? What pressure do I put on? I don't want to make him upset, mental health, all these things. And so these are important questions for us to have, conversations for us to have, because it is impacting labor and we need more workers going forward. Younger workers have different expectations. That's okay. We can meet some of those expectations. There's ways for companies to be really successful in that. And I do think there's going to continue to be pressure on employers via unions in some part of the country, but just other employee advocacy groups, employees coming together on social media or Slack or things like that to try to make differences. AI will also play a role. I think we don't know what role that will play quite yet. And then for the economy, things look pretty good for 2024, but there are speed bumps ahead. And I need to put the election on here because that's certainly one as well. But geopolitical issues, potential government shutdown, inflation could bounce back, right? Anything that makes supply chain work. There's all sorts of things going on. But right now, at this snapshot moment in time, things look really good from a macro point of view. Very important. The FOMC, we just don't really know, like rates. Do they go up a little more? Do they start going down? Are there going to be broader impacts? Does consumption continue to grow? It's really blown my mind. And are rates now high enough to get back to the 2% target? It looks like the idea of a soft landing is possible. So it's going to be really incredibly interesting to see. And I think one thing, and this has come up in several of these questions, there are going to be winners and losers going forward. The Carolinas as a whole, I see no scenario where the Carolinas are not winners, but parts of the Carolinas are going to be on the losing side of this. There are going to be rural parts of the state that are really going to struggle. And so I think continuing to think about policy initiatives, education initiatives that will help that are very, very important. So I'll stop there and maybe we'll have another couple minutes for questions if you want to put them in. Okay, I see somebody here curious what, if any, research is evaluating discrimination for workers 50 plus that still want to work but can't make it through ATS. I don't know what ATS stands for. Can somebody help me out in that in the Q&A? I do think that one of the things I encourage, somebody's helping me out here, applicant tracking system. Oh, automatic resume screeners. Okay, thank you for that. I do know what those are. Great question. I don't know of any particular research, but I do think that I encourage companies regularly to think about how they can engage older workers. older workers have tremendous skills, tremendous institutional knowledge. They don't want to go to useless meetings. They don't want to do they want to work. They want to come in and contribute. So is there a way to hire 2 older workers part-time if they want to work part-time and not have a full-time worker? I think that's something that some companies are starting to think about. They're gonna have to think more about it because of the labor shortages. But I don't know of any true research. I think, Joanna, I think I answered all the other ones.
Yeah, that was a lot, and it was amazing. I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's hard to listen to this kind of presentation when it's someone that is not as engaging as you, because there's a lot of data there, but you made it extremely interesting, and you brought it back to some real perspectives that we can all value. So again, Laura, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. At NCEDA, we really strive to keep our economic developers' toolboxes full. And so we know that the future of our state and our country are really vitally important to the efforts that we're all doing here, boots on the ground. So to all those joining us today, we hope that Laura's presentation gave you some valuable insights, and perhaps we can all use them in our work or to help us better serve our communities. So just a couple of quick things before we adjourn. Yes, we will be making the slides that Laura presented available, so you all will have access to those. We want to again thank our annual sponsors for their support, and again, thanks to all of you for joining us here today. We hope that you will be able to join us in one of our upcoming events. We have a couple I'll just mention quickly. We have our Greenville area networking luncheon, which will be held tomorrow in Greenville, January 18th. And then we have the Emerging Executives Forum, which will be held February 7th through 8th in Greensboro. And of course, our spring conference will be held March 5th through 6th in Pinehurst. So registration is open for all those events. You can find the registration links on the e-newsletter that you should have received in your inbox, or you can find it on the NCEDA website. Again, Laura, thanks again for being here with us today. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this webinar. We hope you have a great day, and please stay warm out there.